Welcome everyone, I'm Dr Nick Bearman and I'm going to be taking you through these next 3 videos on using consumer data in research. So we're going to cover 3 different things over the 3 separate videos. So firstly, we're going to think a bit about what is consumer data. So what is this data and what can we actually do with it? What's the sort of thing we might use it for? And then in the second video, we'll go on to a little bit of some examples of what we can do with it. In the third video, we'll talk about a few methods. These are all short videos, so 10-15 minutes long, so hopefully quite easy to dip in and out of. So, well, what is consumer data? So, it's a relatively new term, but it's kind of helpful to think about consumer data arises out of everyday transactions for goods and services carried out between individuals and organizations. So loyalty card data is a great example of this. So you do your shopping, you pay for your shopping, you might have a loyalty card to get points or whatnot, but that data about what you bought can give us some really, really interesting insights. But it is wider than loyalty card data. So it's any kind of transactional based data. So we could be looking at house sales, we could be looking at council transactions, all sorts of different types of transactions. This data can be personal and can be confidential. So we need to look after it and use it in acceptable ways, use it in a way that's consistent with good research practice. And it's also an increasing proportion of all data that's collected about citizens today. So, we have census data, which is very comprehensive. But this consumer data is much more frequent and can be much more useful than census data. It's also worth saying geospatial. Most of this data is often geospatial as well. And I'm a geographer by training, so we'll come back to geospatial in due course, but the geospatial element of consumer data is often the key bit and a really useful proportion of it. Yeah, equally, some people are very keen on data is, and some people use data are. I tend to use them interchangeably. I'll probably go for data is, that's the one I generally use, but feel free to hear whichever you prefer. So there's a little bit on what consumer data is, but how does it relate to this term big data that you may well have come across as well? And big data is often defined as data that you can't open with Microsoft Excel. And we usually interpret that to mean that it's more than 1 million rows of data, something along those lines. And there are all sorts of big data out there. You get sensor data, Internet of Things, some transaction data does count as big data, but a lot of consumer data isn't big data. Think about the consumer data that the Consumer Data Research Centre hold. About 2/3 of that is not big data. We might call it small data, if you like, or you can open it in Excel and do some work with it in Excel. The really big thing to think about consumer data is that it's always secondary data. So the data is not collected in mind for research. It's collected for some other reason, for the company running the loyalty card scheme or the company processing the transactions or whatever it might be. So we need to bear that in mind when we do some analysis with it. Also, some of these consumer data sets are what we might call analysis ready. So they're all nice and clean and tidy. You're very clear with what you're getting. You can load it up, you can do your analysis. Some of them are very raw data. So they might be very big files, they might be very unstructured data, and they need quite a lot of processing before you can actually do some useful analysis with that. So that we've got these kind of 2 types of consumer data. So just thinking about kind of what data is available, I mentioned a couple of examples already, but loyalty card data, transaction data, house sale data are probably the big ones. You can get data from Airbnb, and you could theoretically get data from TripAdvisor and that sort of thing. All sorts of stuff to do with travel, social media data, I would argue comes under consumer data. Smartphone logs, smart energy meter readings, all sorts. And there's lots and lots out there. But one really useful thing that we can do with them is complement more traditional sources about consumers. So we have various different surveys. We've got the census, we've got the ONS longitudinal survey. And this comparison can be really, really useful because we know the provenance, we know the representativeness of these big surveys, and we can compare those with the consumer data to say, yeah, okay, do we have, is our consumer data representative? Is it a good sample? You know, who's included in this data? And more importantly, who's not included in this data as well? So where do we actually get it from? So, you know, there's a few specific sources. So the Consumer Data Research Centre is one of these. They host a number of data sets. They're funded by the ESRC to supply these data sets for research. You can get some of it from commercial companies. You know, some companies are really, really open with the data they collect. So Zoopla are a great example. They have an API. You can use it to get some of their data about the house sales and rental listings and do all sorts of interesting stuff with it. You know, on the flip side, you know, some companies who collect consumer data are very, very closed with it. You know, Google and Facebook could be the prime examples here. And this is because their business model is centered on making use of that consumer data because it has monetary value for them. So they can use it to target advertising primarily. So, you know, there's lots of consumer data, not all of it is accessible for us. And there's also, you know, other sources as well. So there's the UK Data Service, the Office of National Statistics, all hold a whole range of data sets, and some of those are consumer data. So there's lots of different places you can get this data from, and lots of potential for combining these consumer data and traditional data sets. Yeah, and this combination can be quite useful to provide more insights. So a nice example of that is looking at the housing market, you know, and the census will give us information on migration every 10 years, and only down to the local authority level. But if we look at some of the housing data, we can find migration information annually. We can probably do annual estimates, and we can get much more specific than just to a local authority. So it can be a really, really useful tool. However, it is not a silver bullet. You know, this consumer data, sometimes the analysis can be very tricky, depending on what the data is and what sort of work we're doing with it. You know, for example, some providers have done some work already on this raw data to produce some what they call analysis-ready data products. So that can be really, really helpful. And equally, once we do some analysis, we'll often find patterns in these data. But I would say the reasons why these patterns are here are the interesting bit. You know, in some cases, the patterns might be very obvious. You know, if we're looking at transport data, we can have a morning rush hour peak and evening rush hour peak, you know, and that makes sense. But sometimes these reasons may not be very, very obvious. So we need to bear that in mind and think about, okay, why might these relationships exist? And so how do we actually, you know, work with some of these? You know, we've talked about it being secondary data already, and some of them are quite raw, quite big files, unstructured, difficult to work with. Data linkage is often key to getting a lot of this information out. So, for example, you know, we've got some data from Zoopla on house sales, and we could look at that and it tell us, you know, a lot about house sales and prices and frequency and so on. But if we combine that with some rental data as well, we can start to tell us a bit about, okay, where do we get sales? Where do we get rentals? And if we kind of bring that into some energy performance certificate data and electoral roll data, we can start to tie all that together and look at the housing market as a whole and migration and say, okay, we've got some rentals, we've got some sales, and we know kind of roughly where people are going. So, you know, are there certain locations where people tend to go from rented property to purchasing a house? And are the houses getting bigger? So they're going from a 1-bed flat to a 2-bed house. Or are they downsizing? You know, are they going from a 4-bedroom house to a 3-bedroom house? And are they going to different areas as well? So we can get a lot of extra data from that. And so, you know, the results can give us a lot of information, but not all of it is necessarily useful. And so how do we actually go about interpreting these? So domain experts are key, you know, as is collaboration. So, you know, if it very much depends on what area you're working in. But if you're looking at, rental data, it's really useful to have someone who knows about housing tenure involved in your project. If you're dealing with fuel poverty, looking at fuel data, does that include information on prepayment meters? That's an important thing to think about because they're a very different subset of customer. And if they are included or are not included, that's going to have quite a big impact on your data and on your results. And there's a couple of different ways you can look at this. You could already be a domain expert in a certain area and then learn some of the consumer data and data analysis techniques. Or you could do it the other way around. So you could be an expert in the consumer data and the analysis techniques and learn the domain as well. So, which is most useful really depends on your background and what you want to do. But it's important to have those two aspects in your research team somewhere. One other key kind of aspect when thinking about interpreting this is representativeness of data. So how representative is the consumer data that we're using? And this is where the domain knowledge is key, because if you're very stuck into the data, you can almost not see the wood for the trees, as it were. So you need to think about, okay, who's in this data, but also who's not in this data. And so what sort of methods can we actually do with these? What do we need? So we talked a little bit about kind of domain knowledge, but we have some specific technical skills as well. So there's some data science skills that might be needed, particularly for working with some of the rawer forms of data, as it were. And GIS, or geographical information science, is also a key element as well, because a lot of the data is spatial in its nature. It has a location, so it could be a postcode, an address, coordinates, or a local authority. But the geographical element is a key way of bringing multiple sets of data together. Yeah. The other aspect is we need to think a little bit about data governance and GDPR. And this is because the data we're working with potentially could be individuals' information, individual level records. And so we need to handle this in a sensitive and responsible manner. Yeah, and the COVID tracing app is a great example of this. So when COVID first came upon us back in early 2020, there was a lot of discussion about tracing apps and how do you trace who might have potentially infected who. And there was these two big approaches, centralized or decentralized. And centralized was pushed by a lot of governments, but that recorded who was in contact with who in a central database. And there's a lot of very sensitive information there in terms of where people have been, and it was open for abuse potentially, depending who had access to it. But then a decentralized approach was developed where there's no central database, but you still manage to do the same contact tracing, but in a different way. And it's a much more secure way of dealing with this because there is no central database, so the data can't be breached. So interesting things to think about. And a key element of this is training, and the training is really important in many of the kind of tools and techniques that you need to use. And it's available as well. So whether it's data science, whether it's GIS, whether it's data governance, GDPR, or any of the other aspects that we've touched a bit about, there's lots of training courses out there. So NCRM do some, universities do some, and there's commercial options as well. So have a look on the website and see what's out there. So we spent a few minutes looking at what is consumer data. So it's all about data from everyday transactions for goods and services. There's a lot we can do with it. It can be really, really useful, but it's not a silver bullet to all research questions. A couple of key things: it's secondary data, so it's not collected solely for research. It's collected for some other purpose, and we happen to be using it for research. You will need some background knowledge in your domain area, whatever you're looking at, and some specific technical skills as well. So it's data science, GIS, data governance to bring all those together. So for the next video, we're going to look a little bit at what sort of things we can do with consumer data. So we've got some great examples from different data sets and work people have done. So we'll go through those. And then in the final video, we'll look a little bit about what skills do we need to work with consumer consumer data. Thank you very much, and see you in the next video.